Yo guys, what is going on? It's your boy KXVI. Today I'm going to be giving you guys the ultimate guide to making soul samples from scratch. I've been making soul samples for about a year and a half now, and this video is going to cover pretty much everything that I've learned in that time. Before we get into it, this video took a lot of time and effort, so if you could give this video a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button, it would really help out the channel a ton and I'd appreciate it. The loop that I'm showing in this video will be available to download for free in the description down below. Also, if you guys have any questions on this video, just drop them in the comments down below and I'm going to be trying to answer all of them. To make authentic sounding soul samples, you first need to have a basic knowledge and mindset going into it so that you can capture that beautiful vintage soulful sound. 4 essential elements that I'm going to be covering today are chords, instrumentation, effects and mixing, and human feeling. I'm going to go in depth explaining each of these concepts as I show you guys my process of making a soul loop from scratch. Before we get into this, I just want to note that these songs were made at around 120 to 140 BPM, and you really want to kind of stick around this range to make your samples so that you can pitch it and speed it up later, and it'll get that nice Kanye chipmunk soul kind of effect that's really popular nowadays. All soul samples are made with acoustic and analog equipment, so there's no VSTs, no MIDI, nothing like that. And you're really gonna wanna stick to the following instruments to have the right sound palette for these samples. You're gonna want piano or electric piano, guitars, bass guitars, violins, strings, brass like trumpets, trombone, saxophone, stuff like that, organs, acoustic drums, bells like glockenspiels, vibraphones, and of course you're going to need the cherry on top, which really makes your soul loop stand out, which is vocals. Now that we've got the basic instruments out of the way, let's get into section 1 of this video, which is chords. The chords used in these soul samples are a very important element to getting that feeling and soulful vibe that you're looking for. I'm definitely not a music theory god or anything like that, but here's one of my go-to chord progressions and what I'm going to be building my loop off of today. Alright, so as you can tell, that chord progression has a little bit of rhythm and embellishments inside of it that kind of elevate it to the next level, but I'm going to show you guys how to construct that from just the basic chords. Alright, so this MIDI right here is what I would consider level 1 of this chord progression. As you can see here, we've just got some minor 7ths and major 7th chords. So we started off with an A flat major 7th, which is A flat, C, D sharp, and G. And then we went down to a G minor 7th, which is G, B flat, D, and F. And then after that, we go down to the last chord of this progression, which is an F minor 7th, which goes F, G sharp, C, and finally D sharp on top. Now what I did for this last section, I just played that twice, and then I did a transition chord, which is optional, but for this progression I felt like it really helped it. And if I undo the voicings on this, this is a D sharp major 7th, so it just goes down in the scale one more time. But what I did is I just inverted the notes around and I came up with this inversion right here. So as you can tell, it's still really good. There's a lot of room to kind of add on that. And I'm going to show you guys how I first spiced that up by adding some rhythm. So if we come in here, this is the level 2 of this chord progression. And all I've really done is kind of played the chords multiple times just to give it more energy and rhythm. And I'll let you guys hear that. So there's really no extra music theory to this part. I really just added some rhythm while I was playing with my hands, and this is much easier to do when you're actually playing the keys. Moving on to level 3, I've now started to add in a little bit of melody inside and embellishments and stuff like that, and I'll let you guys hear it first and then break it down. So as you can hear, it's pretty much the same idea, but what I've done right here is I just do these little transition notes that are normally following the notes in the chords, just to kind of give it some sauce, you know? So as you can see right here on this A flat major 7th, I took these 2 middle notes, C and D sharp, and I just played them like that, going into the next chord, which kind of sounds nice because it goes here, up one, and then resolves down to that next note of the scale. So I'm just following the notes that are inside the chord and creating little counter melodies from that. As you can see on this next little melody that I did, I walked up the chord that I was playing, and then I played the bottom, the root note on the top right there, because it transitions nicely into this top note right here. As you can see, it's walking up the scale and it resolves nicely going into that G. And the last little riff that I did inside these chords, and this is probably the most complex one that I did, I extended the chord a little bit by adding another note right here, making this, I don't even know what chord, but it works. And then I just walked down again, but with this little out of key note right here, which really helps give it that soul bluesy kind of vibe. And I'll play that riff without that little out of key note just so you can see how much of a difference little stuff like that can make in the feeling of these loops. Now just by adding that little out of key grace note, it goes to this. It's a subtle change, but it really just helps add a nice flavor to the progression. Now, finally, we have level 4 of this chord progression, and what I did for this is I took that initial idea that I played out in MIDI, and I just dubbed over it in MIDI and played some melody over top of it just to give it some more flavor. So as you can see, the melodies are pretty simple, and I'll let you hear what they sound like real quick. And there's really no thought behind these. I just kind of played around with notes that were in the key and we're in C minor here. I'm just playing little accents that create a smooth and nice transition into the next section of the chord progression. Now that we've got a solid chord progression, it's time to talk about instrumentation. Like I said before, all of the instruments used in these samples were acoustic or analog. This makes it extremely difficult to replicate with VSTs. However, as I'm making this loop, I'm going to show you guys some of my favorite VSTs and show you guys a couple techniques that I've picked up on to make those VSTs sound more realistic. So for the first instrument that I like to start with, as you could tell from the chords, is a piano or an electric piano. And the main purpose of using these in a sample is to kind of create a foundation of chords and melodic ideas that you can build off of with your other instruments. The best piano VSTs that I've found for this vintage soul vibe are Keyscape, the vintage upright contact bank, and the piano from the Arturia V collection, which I highly recommend copying because it's only like 25 bucks a month on Splice and you get access to a ton of VSTs on there. The next instrument that I'm going to be breaking down for you guys are acoustic drums, and these are a great way to add instant feeling and authenticity into your soul samples. The best VSTs and sounds that I've found to recreate these vintage drum breaks are Logic Pro's drum sounds, Addictive Drums, and I also just recommend going on Splice and digging through a bunch of their drum breaks, and you can just drag those into your project and instantly level up your soul sample with that. So as you can see, for this sample, I've already created a drum pattern and I've used the Motown Revisited kit. I'm really just trying to keep it simple, but follow the rhythm that I'm playing with the chords. So this is what the drum break sounds like with the piano that we just made. The next instrument that I'm going to cover are violins and strings. Violins and strings are a great way to instantly get more emotion and soul in your loop. I usually use the strings to kind of accent and support melodies and melodic ideas that I have inside of the main chord progression. And a couple ways you can do that is just following the root notes of the chord progression. So for example, if I had a chord progression going from C minor to F minor, I would start with the violin on C and go up to F and maybe add a couple transition notes in between just to give it a little bit of a vibe. But for this sample, I'm going to be using it as more of an accent to little melodic ideas inside of the sample just to kind of emphasize them and help make the progression stand out and feel more unique. I've got some staccato strings loaded up from BBC Symphony Orchestra, which is a great free plugin that you guys should check out. And this is the pattern that I've come up with. As you can see from this MIDI right here, this is a very simple pattern, but it's following a lot of the notes that are in the chord progression, and I'll point them out for you really quick. Before I transition into the second chord, I go from C to D sharp, and if you go up to the piano, I also go from C to D sharp, down to D, which is the note I resolve on here too. So I'm pretty much just copying the MIDI from up there and putting it on a different instrument to layer it and emphasize more on that melodic idea. So I thought that the strings were clashing a little bit too much in that octave, so I just pitched the whole MIDI up one octave, and now the strings sound like this. For our next instrument, we've got guitar. The guitar is another essential element to vintage soul record. They're often used to create rhythm with strumming patterns following the main chords, help emphasize melodic accents and stuff of that nature, and sometimes can even serve as the foundation or main chords for a song. Guitar is incredibly difficult to recreate with MIDI, so I'm actually using my electric guitar today. But a couple of the best VSTs that I found if you're trying to mimic that sound with VSTs are any guitars from the Ample Guitar Collection and also the Ilya FMOB nylon guitar. So now I'm going to show you guys the guitar pattern I came up with. So, since there isn't any MIDI, I'm just going to kind of explain the theory behind the guitar. It's really just following the chords that we built before with the piano, with a couple melodic embellishments throughout just to kind of sauce it up a little bit. Since I'm not the best guitar player, a strategy I like to use is just looking at the MIDI I've created, and then from there moving the chord shapes that I do know up and down the neck just until I'm on that chord. And you can just go online and also just look up chord shapes and just play them one by one and kind of stitch it together in the recording. If you guys can pick up a real guitar, I really recommend it because it will make everything sound authentic in the sample if you do it right. So with everything together, now it sounds like this. Moving on to our next instrument, which is the bass guitar. A live bass is a very subtle but effective way to make your soul samples sound authentic. And I actually do have a live bass that I use in this sample, but it's pretty easy to make a solid bass line with VSTs. The best VSTs that I found to recreate a live bass are the Scarby Rickenbacker bass in Contact, any basses from Trillion, and also the Logic stock basses. And the purpose of using a live bass is really just to thicken up the sound and give it a little bit of low end, which I guess might be kind of pointless because you just take out the low end when you add your own drums. But if you really want to get that authentic sound, you have to do everything like they were doing back in the day to make your sample sound like an actual soul record. So this is what I've got for the bass line. But yeah, anyways, the bass line is just following the root notes of the chords, and I just threw a little bit of transition notes in between here and there, so pretty self-explanatory there. For our next instrument, we've got brass, and in soul music, they use a lot of trumpets, saxophones, trombones, stuff like that. And the main purpose of using these is really to add some accent and put emphasis on notes that you want to emphasize in your sample, and it's a great way of adding kind of power and punch onto certain parts of the sample. A couple great VSTs for recreating that soul sound that I found are Session Horns, East West's Brass Libraries, and once again, the Logic Pro stock sounds. Goated. So I'm going to go ahead and show you guys what pattern I came up with. So as you can see here, we've got a very simple MIDI, and how I came up with these notes right here is I actually went to the chords and I looked at the top notes, which is G, down to F, and then D sharp. And I just wanted to emphasize those top notes and add some more punch on the second half of the loop. And so I added these and layered it in 2 octaves, and this is what it sounds like soloed. Alright, for the next instrument that's essential to these soul and gospel samples, we have the organ. The organ is used in a ton of soul records and especially gospel records. It's a great way to instantly add that soulful character and some movement into your samples. The best VSTs that I've found so far for organs are, again, the stock Logic organ and also the UAD waterfall organ, which I picked up more recently, and that one's really fire too. So making the actual patterns for your organ in your soul sample is pretty easy. You just want to copy the MIDI from your piano or whatever instrument you've made your chords on and simplify the MIDI a little bit just so it's not clashing too much. And I think the best way to kind of think of this is using it as a pad. It's just something that kind of fills out the space. It gives that nice soulful character that you're looking for. So this is what the organ I came up with sounds like all together with the sample. So what I did for the organ on this one is I copied the chords from the main piano, but I just took out the bottom note just so that it was playing a little bit different voicing and there wasn't as much clashing going on. And as you can see, the chords are very simple. There's no rhythm to them, and it's just following the main rhythm of the sample. But the only thing that I've done here that really helps make this sound authentic is I've done this roll that goes up into the organ right here. And how I did this was actually pretty simple. All that you want to do is just record on your MIDI controller you going like this up to the root note that you're trying to play. So for this progression it would be like this. One other essential tip for making your organ sound more realistic and really helping add movement into your sample is to automate the speed of the rotor cabinet or Leslie. And if you don't know what that is, the organ has a thing on it that does this little spinny thing. You'll understand what I'm talking about. So if I play a chord real quick with no spinning, it sounds like this. And if I add the spin to it, it sounds like this. And you can really hear it in higher octaves too. If you can find a rotor cabinet plugin or something like that and you can automate the speed, that will really help add some movement and authenticity into your organ. Alright, and for the last essential instrument to making these soul and gospel samples, we have the bells, something like glockenspiels, vibraphones, and other mallet kind of instruments of that nature. Pretty much the only use that I've found for these in soul samples is to again accent melodic ideas I have in it. I really use them very sparsely, and it's just kind of to add some seasoning and flavor into the loop. The best VSTs for these kind of sounds are Mallet Flux, the Contact Bank, Keyscape, Omnisphere, and of course, the Logic stock sounds. Today, I'm going to be using the Glockenspiel from Mallet Flux, and now I'm just going to record a little pattern for you guys. So as you can tell, this is a super simple MIDI, and if you're wondering how I came up with these notes, we're gonna go back to the piano that I created earlier and you'll see exactly where I got those notes. On this piano right here, we have this little counter melody at the very end of the pattern that goes from G up to B flat, back to G. And it just kind of serves as a nice transition, and I really wanted to emphasize that, so I used the bell to support that sound. One thing that I really like to do when I'm making these bell patterns is leave it exactly as I recorded it. I want it to be as out of time as possible, if that makes sense, because these bells really help give it that human vibe. As you can tell, if I play this as I recorded it, when it's unquantized, it'll sound like this. It sounds nice and real, but if I take it and I quantize it perfectly on the grid, it still has a nice sound to it, but it really doesn't have the same exact feeling as when I originally played it. But yeah, that's it on the bells. Let's move on to the vocals. Vocals are the holy grail of soul samples. They are the most essential thing if you want your loop to stand out and really be next level. And with that being said, they're probably the hardest part to get right. For this sample, I'm actually going to be sending this to my vocalist who's going to do some custom vocals for it. But before I was working with vocalists, I had a couple strategies on getting vocals that were pretty effective. East West Composer Cloud has a couple sound banks that have backup singers, which can be really good for adding choirs and stuff like that. And the way that I would use these banks is to just copy the chords from your piano and play with the pattern from there to fit the soul sample that you're making. Another place I recommend going for vocals is Splice, which is a great source of royalty-free vocals that you can get for your soul loops, which you can just drag in, put it to the right key and tempo, and they'll definitely level up your soul sample from just the music. So I just sent this idea to my vocalist. I'm gonna have her do her thing, and then I'm gonna get back to you guys with that result and continue the rest of this video. So it's been a couple days. I just got the vocals back, and I'm gonna let you guys hear what they sound like with the rest of the melody. So as I've been recording this video, I've realized that it's going to end up being a very long video. So if this video does well, I'm going to drop part 2 where I'm going over the effects and mixing and how I would flip this idea into a full beat, chop it up, everything like that. I'm going to go in depth with that. So if you guys enjoyed this video, give it a like, give it a comment. Any questions that you guys have, drop them down below and I'll answer them. And that's it for this one. Peace.